This recording accompanies your ethnography on the Noodle Narratives, the story of the globalization of noodles. It begins even before the invention of instant noodles, but with several other stories of globalization. The first story of globalization occurred nearly 8,000 years ago with the domestication of wheat in the Middle East and its spread to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It then followed another tradition in which that wheat, which is filled with gluten, could be turned into delicious noodles. And that transmission took place as noodles flowed into Japan from China. And the third part of the globalization story of ramen took place during the shogunate. The shogunate was the period of Japanese history in the 16 and 1700s and 1800s before the restoration of the emperor in the late 1800s. And during that period of time, things that were foreign, things that were influences considered to be non-Japanese, were forbidden. And many of the ordinary people couldn't eat anything but those things which could be grown in Japan, rice and seafood, things that could be consumed in the local environment. And when that restriction was lifted in the late 1800s, many new flavors and exciting new cuisines reinvigorated Japanese cuisine, including the use of ramen, which would be a quick dish that could be conveniently made at home or in small diners. And it was made in either pork broth or, in the very rare, at least into the 20th century, chicken broth, and decorated in the ways in which we are accustomed. But it wasn't until after World War II that you really saw a shift in the way people thought about ramen. Ramen became pre-cooked, a convenience food, instant ramen, noodles that could be made very quickly. You see on your left a Wei noodle factory in Yunnan in China, a Muslim minority which customizes the production of noodles to include a halal diet, a diet appropriate to Muslims. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the iconic Cup of Noodles Museum in Japan. And lest this seem too exotic to you, think of all the different kinds of museums we have even in the United States. In the East Bay, there's a museum for pinball machines. Where there's a passion, there's a museum. And people think about the theme of what that cup of noodles means to them in the post-World War II environment. It means convenience and modernization and invention and exploration. As instant noodles globalized to new markets, there were different strategies that were used. One strategy is that as a relatively cheap food, it should be marketed to relatively poor people, people without a lot of money to buy expensive noodles, who had a lot of time to prepare things from scratch. And one of the chief targets for these instant noodles was you, the student body of universities and colleges. It was assumed that these are folks that are relatively poor, at least temporarily, before you graduate from college and get wonderful paying jobs. And during this period of enforced poverty, you have to eat the cheapest foods possible. Nor do you have elaborate cooking facilities available to you, so cup of noodles is completely the answer to your prayers. And so this U.S. target audience was those who were temporarily poor and young. Now, a second market for instant noodles came through to the United States in a different direction. Instant noodles were made and marketed in Mexico. And in Mexico, they were marketed not by Nissin, not by the company that made cup of noodles, but by Maruchan. And they recontextualized the flavors. They took the product, instant noodles, and put it in a new context and gave it new flavors, Mexican flavors, and a new meaning, a kind of food that could be instantly used and conveniently used in Mexican households. And it's through that connection that it came into the United States and throughout the Southwest and into California. A third use case for this new product, for cup of noodles, surprised folks. And in an ethnography done by Sandra Kate, a retired professor from San Jose State University, who looked at prisons in San Francisco and in Sacramento, the idea of a prison spread shows another use for instant noodles. Now, instant noodles are the kinds of things that are relatively cheap and would be in the kinds of canteens available to prisoners. So for a very small amount of money, they could buy instant noodles, they could buy Doritos, they could buy beans, they could buy flavorings. And in this case, they put it all together into a prison spread where you can make the food, make it communally, and eat it communally. And if you remember the concept of reciprocity, reciprocity is the idea of sharing, that sharing builds community. You see an example of this in the prison spread. And of course, these are noodles that are not only being marketed to the poor in the developed world, but also to the people of the developing world. And in the upcoming videos, you see commercials directed to New Guinea and then to Nigeria. Now, as you look at these commercials, look very carefully for who this is being marketed to. Children, and of course, the parents of children, and the messages of fun and experimentation and mother love that are inherent in these commercials.
Oh. Hmm? So delicious, so tasty, and delicious, taste for you. Indomie kakaroo.
You biggest kakaroo.
So delicious. Indomie kakaroo noodles, fast to cook and so delicious and nutritious.
Because I love picking them well.
Mama, why all the picking for we yard? They come our house every day.
Because them too like the taste of Indomie. And them sabi say I dey like to cook am for them all the time. Mama be like you. No noodles be like Indomie.
Indomie instant noodles. Tasty nutrition. Good.
And of course, the last part of your book looks at questions of globalization that Cup of Noodles solve. That is to say, we have a Malthusian dilemma, a dilemma of too many people. So many people that we can't feed people with the best organic food, the best vegetables and fruit, the best crops, the best meat. That's simply not plausible for 7 billion people, soon to be 8 billion people. So how do we fill the bellies of people who work in ways that they can't grow their own food? They work in cities so they can have minimal access to fresh food. What do they eat? And how do they eat in a capitalist environment where you must purchase food? And Cup of Noodles, although they are not an optimal food, not the most delicious food, are still nutritious. They provide calories. They provide 20% of the daily iron. They're actually not as bad as you might think. They're giving you a whopping load of sodium, and they certainly couldn't be categorized as a health food, but they will keep people nourished. So it is an ultimate compromise. In some parts of the world, like Papua New Guinea, they may mean this is a modern convenience. This speaks to modernity. In other parts of the world, this is a cheap food. It's a food appropriate for the poor. Let's think about the entire commodity chain, from the wheat that is grown and the other products that go into your cup of noodles, to the processing, packaging, transportation, retailing, consumption, and ultimately waste. What are the unintended consequences of the use of cup of noodles? What are happening to the skills that used to be in families to produce food from scratch? How are convenience foods eroding those cultural patterns. What are people doing with the waste? When I first did my fieldwork in Suriname so many decades ago, I lived in a village that it had stores with the kinds of products that you see that had packaging for the very first time. Most of everything they consumed, they produced themselves, and the waste products that were produced were made of completely compostable matter, wood, basketry, food things. They would dump them at the edge of the village, and ultimately, a year later, they would be completely reabsorbed into the environment or washed away. There was virtually no garbage. But when you start introducing packaging, plastic, those same behaviors are in place. People still throw that garbage at the edge of the village, but now it doesn't go away. They lack the infrastructure to deal with the garbage. And even if you think of urban developed places like San Jose, yes, we have landfill, but does it ever go away? So the unintended consequences of convenience foods like cup of noodles are catastrophic waste. And in the next portion of the class, we'll consider the impact of catastrophic waste on global health. And that will make you look at your cup of noodles in an entirely new way.